Hi, Modern World History students. We're continuing unit number 7, The Rise of Totalitarian Dictators. And this is a continuation also of section number 4, the Second Russian Revolution. In our previous lesson, we did the first part of section number 4, in which I introduced you to the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and the Tsarists, 3 political groups that were in conflict with each other, really, in the months during which Russia was ruled by its provisional government. Now, we're going to see what that culminated in, what that conflict ended up with, which is a second Russian Revolution in October and November of 1917. So, by the end of this section, you'll be able to explain how V.I. Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in a second Russian Revolution. We'll introduce you to the phrase peace, land, and bread, as well as Mr. Lenin. That was his phrase. And we'll talk about the storming of the Winter Palace. And then we'll move on to section 5 as well. But for now, I want to introduce you to V.I. Lenin. So I'm at the bottom of page 7. So here's Lenin. His name, when he was born, was Viktor Ilyich Ulyanov. And this was not a classic Russian name. And Russians tend to be rather, we'll say, prejudiced in favor of people who are ethnically like them in terms of whom they can accept as a leader. And you have to remember that Russia was an empire, that Russia, over the course of hundreds of years, had conquered many different nations of people and had incorporated them into the Russian Empire. And as a result of that, there were people like V.I. Lenin or Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov who did not have sort of classic ethnic Russian names. Well, again, if you wanted to sort of get anywhere in Russian politics, if you wanted to be a leader in Russia, you needed a classic Russian name. And so later on in his adult life, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov changed his name to V.I. Lenin. What's interesting about this is you say, oh, okay, well, the VI stands for Vladimir Ilyich, right? Because that was his name before he changed his name. Technically, it's not true. When Lenin changed his name, he changed his name legally to VI. He eliminated his original first and middle names, simply referring to himself as VI. So technically, his name was V.I. Lenin. By the way, before you get too sort of critical of the Russians about their preference for Russian last names among their leaders, run through the names of people who have run for president in the United States. How many of them aren't English? Biden, Trump, Gore, Bush, Kerry, Romney. There are exceptions, the most notable one being Obama. But you've also had Roosevelts, which are Dutch and not English. You had Eisenhower, who is German, not English. But the rest of them, it's a line of Kennedys, Carters, Fords, Hoovers. It's a lot of English last names. So don't be too critical of the Russians for their preference for ethnically Russian last names and their leaders. We Americans tend to be that way. We tend to prefer English last names. But anyway, just a little comment about that. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, as a boy, was not a radical. As a teenager, he was not a radical. But his older brother was. His older brother, who was in his 20s, was a radical. And because of that, his older brother was targeted by the Tsar's secret police, and they eventually got him. Lenin's older brother was killed by the secret police of the Tsar. And really, that is what turned Lenin into a radical. And Lenin was also not originally a communist. When he became a radical, when he turned against the Tsar because the Tsar's secret police had killed his brother, he began searching for a philosophy. Lenin was a thinker. He began searching for a philosophy that would support the overthrow of the Tsar. And it was then that he began reading the works of Karl Marx. And that's how he became a Marxist. He was looking for a philosophy that supported revolution. And of course, Marxism or communism does. And so Lenin became a communist, or if you prefer, a Marxist, really largely because he was searching for a philosophy that would support the overthrow of the Tsar, because the Tsar's secret police had murdered his brother. So he joined, or was a founding member of, the Bolsheviks. Remember the Bolsheviks, they're the Communist Party of Russia, the majority party, or big party, as they called themselves, because they saw themselves representing the interests of the vast majority of the Russian people, as opposed to a small group of elites. So he joined the Bolsheviks, and of course what that meant was that he now was a radical, and he was now targeted by the secret police, and he was in danger. And so as a result of that, Lenin did not spend his entire adult life in Russia. As a matter of fact, he was sort of in and out of Russia, and he spent large portions of his adult life prior to the revolution in other countries. As a matter of fact, when World War I broke out, Lenin was in Switzerland. So Switzerland was a neutral country. It is always a neutral country. Switzerland manages to stay out of all the major European wars. Switzerland is the most mountainous country in Europe, and therefore is not a country that is likely to be invaded by anybody. It's very difficult going to move through Switzerland. And the Swiss have been neutral as a result of that in almost all of the major really all the major European wars. Nobody tries to invade Switzerland. Switzerland, the only way to get around is through the railroads, really. And Switzerland, in order to protect their neutrality, they've actually mined all of their railroad tunnels with explosives. So if anybody tries to invade Switzerland by using the rails, they can simply blow up the railroad tunnels and stop it from happening. It just goes to show you how committed the Swiss are to being neutral. So Lenin, in order to avoid being drafted into an army, when the war broke out, he had made his way to Switzerland. And that's where he was when the first Russian Revolution happened. It was a huge shock to him because, of course, the Bolsheviks had always expected that they would lead a revolution in Russia. That was the entire reason for the establishment of the Bolshevik Party. They intended to lead a revolution against the Tsar and overthrow the Tsar and establish a communist dictatorship and a communist state in Russia. So you can imagine how shocked Lenin was in March of 1917 as he sat there in Switzerland to hear that the Russian Revolution had happened without him and without the Bolsheviks, that the Tsar had been overthrown not by this sort of group of revolutionaries, sort of almost professional revolutionaries, which is how the Bolsheviks regarded themselves, but the Tsar had been overthrown simply through the actions of regular people, dissatisfied workers and soldiers. And I'm sure that Lenin was crestfallen, like so disappointed that the revolution had happened without him and without the Bolsheviks, and was probably quite depressed by the whole string of events. But then Lenin heard that the Tsar had been replaced by this provisional government. And more importantly, that the provisional government had decided to keep Russia in the war, had decided not to take Russia out of the war, but had decided to keep Russia in the war. And that's when Lenin took heart, because he said, Russia is utterly ill-equipped to fight this war. He was right. He understood better why Russia was losing the war than the Tsar or Kerensky did. It wasn't because the Russian soldiers were not properly motivated. It was because Russia was not a modern society that could compete with Germany. And so Lenin was convinced that Russia was absolutely doomed to lose the war. And he was equally convinced that the provisional government's decision to keep Russia in the war would now open the door for a second Russian Revolution. And he was right. The Germans were thinking the same thing. The Germans, of course, had been happy when the Russian Revolution happened because they expected that would mean Russia would then drop out of the war, which means that the war would be over on the Eastern Front, and Germany could start concentrating its efforts on beating the British, French, and Belgians on the Western Front. The Germans were disappointed when they learned that the Provisional Government of Russia would keep Russia in the war. And so the Germans and Lenin both sort of had the same ideas going on. A second Russian Revolution was needed. And it was the Germans who actually sought out Lenin. And the Germans provided Lenin with a special armored train. And they provided him transport back into Russia on board this second armored train. And Lenin arrived in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, then in April of 1917. And he and the other Bolsheviks began an effort now to launch a second Russian Revolution. Now, the reason why Lenin was free to make public speeches like the one you see here on the right is that the Tsar was no longer in charge. Remember, the secret police had all been rounded up and arrested by the People's Militia. And with the Tsar and the secret police no longer in a position to arrest people with radical ideas, and with Russia anyway as a sort of a democracy where you're allowed to have radical ideas and you were allowed to compete in elections, Lenin was free, and the other Bolsheviks were free now to try to rally the public in support of their cause. And in particular, Lenin promised three things to the Russian people: peace, land, and bread. Peace, land, and bread. That was maybe the simplest political slogan and the most fundamental, basic political slogan ever invented. The Russian people wanted those three things, and Lenin knew it. Peace first, because after all, the war had been the primary, fundamental cause of the Russian people's suffering and misery. Peace first. That would then open the door to redistributing the land to the Russian people, taking it from the nobles and redistributing it to the common people. And once they had that, once they had land and peace, then they could get back to work producing grain so there would be adequate bread for everyone to eat. So the slogan that Lenin used to appeal to the Russian people after he returned to Russia in April of 1917 was peace, land, bread. And of course, he railed against the Provisional Government for not making peace with the Germans. So I'm moving on now to the top of page 8 and the events, the immediate events that brought about this second Russian Revolution. So for about, 6 months, Lenin and the other Bolsheviks worked to build their appeal with the Russian people. Building it around the criticism of the Provisional Government for not ending Russia's misery by ending the war. And of course, building it around this slogan, peace, land, bread. Lenin and the Bolsheviks sought to appeal to as many of the Russians in the major cities as possible. That's where the revolution was going to happen. It was going to happen in Petrograd. It was going to happen in Moscow, all the big cities. And the other thing that Lenin and the Bolsheviks did is they deliberately sought to appeal to soldiers of the Russian army. Again, they were the ones who were suffering the most from the war. And that suffering, of course, had not come to an end with the abdication of the Tsar. It had not come to an end with the creation of the Provisional Government, because the Provisional Government had decided to keep Russia in the war. So the soldiers in particular were vulnerable to the appeal of the Bolsheviks, with the promise that with a Bolshevik revolution, the war would come to an end finally. And so by October of 1917, almost all of the units of the Russian army in and around Petrograd, and also almost all the units of the Russian Navy as well in and around Petrograd, had now switched over to the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks had succeeded in appealing to them and getting them on their side with the promise of peace, land, and bread. And so, one night, units of the Russian army that were loyal to the Bolsheviks surrounded what was called the Winter Palace. So the Winter Palace can be seen here, and also a portion of it here. The Winter Palace had been the Tsar's palace in the capital, in St. Petersburg or in Petrograd. It had been built at the order of Peter the Great, almost 200 years before this, and it had continued to be the residence of the Tsar all the way up until the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. The building had been taken over by the Provisional government and had become sort of the headquarters for the Provisional government. A lot of the leaders of the Provisional government, really all the leaders of the Provisional government, including the Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky, had their offices and even had their residences in the Winter Palace. Now, the Winter Palace was surrounded by soldiers loyal to the Bolsheviks, around 5,000 soldiers loyal to the Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, out in the harbor, remembering that St. Petersburg or Petrograd had been built on a natural harbor where the Neva River flows into the Baltic Sea, out in the harbor there was a battleship called the Aurora, which is now moored alongside the Winter Palace and is a museum, it's part of a museum. The battleship Aurora had also come under the control of Bolshevik naval officers and sailors. And across the harbor, a fortress which guarded the harbor called the Peter and Paul Fortress was now also under the control of the Bolsheviks. The battleship and the fortress now trained their cannons on the facade of the Winter Palace and began blasting holes in the side of the palace, setting the palace in part on fire. At which point, most of the leaders of the Provisional government fled. Right? When the palace came under fire from the battleship Aurora and the guns of the Peter and Paul Fortress, most of the Provisional government leaders fled from the palace. And at that point then, the 5,000 Bolshevik soldiers sort of moved in, took over the palace, and overthrew the Provisional government in what's called a coup. Remember, we used the word coup when we were talking about Napoleon Bonaparte. The full phrase is coup d'état, a blow to the state, right? And remember, we talked about how some coups, some attempts to overthrow the government are successful and some are not. This one was. For what it's worth, Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky, the leader of the Provisional government, escaped. He escaped from Russia and spent the rest of his life here in the United States as a history professor at Stanford University in California. Can you imagine being a student at the university, at Stanford University, and going in for your Russian history class to discover that your professor is the former leader of Russia? But that's how he spent the rest of his life. So the Provisional government fled and the Bolsheviks took over. And Lenin, in a message broadcast to the Russian people via radio, did not really hide what he had done. He said to them in his message, "Citizens of Russia, the Provisional government has been deposed," which means overthrown. He stated very clearly to the Russian people, "I have overthrown the government. I have overthrown the Provisional government." The next thing he said was kind of a lie. He said, "All power now resides with the Petrograd Soviet." So he said that he was creating a government then that was led by the people's representatives. In reality, that wasn't true. I mean, the Petrograd Soviet were the elected representatives of the people, but in reality, he wasn't handing over the power of the government to them. He was going to establish instead a dictatorship of which he would be the leader. So he started with a truth: "I've overthrown the government." He then followed up with a lie: "All power will now reside with the Petrograd Soviet, the people's representatives." In reality, Lenin was going to establish a dictatorship. So it was he referred to it as a Soviet government, because he said that it was a government led by the Petrograd Soviet, the representatives of the workers and soldiers. And that's why the government of Soviet Russia, or Bolshevik Russia, adopted this symbol, the symbol that you see over Lenin's shoulder in this sort of painting here. So this symbol has really three parts. You see a hammer, and you see a sickle, and then you see a star. A hammer, a sickle, and a star. And those three symbols represent the three parts of the Soviet government. The hammer represents the workers. The star represents the soldiers. If you remember, when the Petrograd Soviet and the other Soviets around Russia were first established, they were the councils of the workers and soldiers representatives. Now, of course, in reality, Russia was not a very modern society, so there weren't that many factory workers. In time, if you were really going to represent the great masses of the Russian people, you needed also to represent the peasants. And that's what is represented. Those are the people represented by the sickle. The sickle is a curved blade used to cut wheat. And it was a blade then used by Russia's peasants to harvest wheat. So the symbol of the Bolshevik movement, the symbol of the Bolshevik Revolution, of the Soviet government, was the hammer, the sickle, and the star on a red flag, red being the color of revolution. But as I said, as much as Lenin proclaimed that he was creating a Soviet government, a government led by the representatives of the workers and peasants and soldiers, in reality, he was establishing a dictatorship. Although the people of Russia continued to be invited to elect representatives to the Soviet turned out to be more like the Duma, because real decisions were being made by Lenin and by a small group of Bolshevik leaders who advised Lenin. They were known as commissars. You don't need to know that, but that was the group of advisors of Lenin. They were known as commissars. And the real decisions were being made by them. The Soviet had symbolic power, but no real power. It was, in fact, a dictatorship. And as a matter of fact, it was not even simply a communist dictatorship, because a communist dictatorship would have simply taken over the factories and the farms and the railroads and operated them in order to promote equality. But Lenin immediately took steps to try to control people's beliefs and their thoughts as well, because as soon as the Bolshevik coup was successful, and as soon as he was established as the leader of Soviet Russia, he immediately abolished all other political parties. The Bolshevik Party was the only legal political party in Russia. All other political parties were prohibited, abolished, made illegal. They were not allowed to have an opposition political party. And so elections, which continued to be held, even though there was just the one political party, the Bolshevik Party, elections became meaningless. So you didn't have a choice in elections. All the way up until the collapse of Soviet Russia in 1991, they continued to hold elections, but the only candidates that were available on your ballot were the ones who were approved by the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. The Bolshevik Party approved who could be a candidate to serve in the Supreme Soviet, for example. And so it was really the party and the party's leadership that was making all the decisions. Even if you voted to elect someone as your representative in the Soviet, they were selected by the party's leaders, and they did what they were told. So it had the facade, the illusion of a democracy, but in fact it was a dictatorship. And it was a dictatorship in which not only were they going to take away your economic choices, because it was a communist dictatorship, but also they were taking away your personal choices. You couldn't choose to join an opposition or alternative political party. Additionally, not only did they outlaw opposition political parties, but Lenin also outlawed all media, newspapers, radio, and then of course later on television as well, that were not controlled by the party. So the only newspapers that were allowed were the ones that were published by the Bolshevik Party. The only radio and then later on television networks that were allowed were the ones that were allowed to broadcast, were the ones controlled by the Bolshevik Party. So not only was the Bolshevik Party the only legal political party, but it was also operating the only legal newspaper, which, by the way, was called Pravda, which is the Russian word for truth. Okay? So the only legal newspaper was the one controlled by the Bolshevik Party, Pravda, and the only legal radio and television broadcasts were the ones controlled by the Bolshevik Party as well. So there were really elements from the very beginning, there were also elements of fascism in Lenin's dictatorship. He was not only taking control of your economic choices in order to implement communism and achieve an equal society, he was also taking control of your personal choices by outlawing all opposition political parties and allowing only media, newspapers, radio, later on television, that were controlled by the Bolshevik Party. So what do you call it when you combine elements of communism with elements of fascism? We call that totalitarianism, because Lenin and his dictatorship sought to control every aspect of your life, both your economic choices and your personal choices. The way you think, what you believe, were to be under Lenin's control as well. So from the very beginning, although he called himself a communist, Lenin's dictatorship was a totalitarian dictatorship. Now, we're moving on to section number 5, and we're going to talk about some of the threats that were out there and how Lenin dealt with those threats. So in this part, again, we won't complete section 5 in this lesson, but we'll start it. So we're going to talk about how Lenin and the Bolsheviks dealt with some of the external threats facing Soviet Russia, specifically, really importantly, the German invasion, which was still going on. So we'll review the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. We'll also talk about how Lenin and the Bolsheviks dealt with some of the internal threats facing Soviet Russia. And we'll talk about the Cheka and the Red Terror there. And then in later lessons, we'll deal with some of these other items and talk about how the Soviet Union was formed. But for now, we're moving on to the top of page 9. And the greatest threat facing Soviet Russia at the very beginning was the German invasion. And we have to remember that. Russia underwent 2 revolutions, but neither one of those revolutions meant that the Germans were going to stop invading Russia. Germany wasn't going to stop their invasion of Russia until Russia surrendered and signed a treaty with them. And of course, Lenin knew that having promised the Russian people peace, land, and bread, and he knew that peace was the key to achieving the other 2 things, and he knew that the Russian people regarded the war as the primary source of their misery, he knew that the first thing he had to do upon taking control of Russia was to deliver peace. If he did not deliver peace, then there could be a 3rd Russian Revolution. The primary reason why the Tsar was overthrown, the primary reason why the Provisional Government was overthrown was because the people were exhausted from the war, and they were exhausted from the misery and suffering that they were subjected to because of the war. He had to achieve peace. And so he did. He immediately entered into negotiations with the German government to produce an end to the war. And if you remember, the name of the treaty that was signed between Bolshevik Russia and the German government was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It was a very costly treaty for Russia. They gave up an enormous amount of land. The land that they gave up included about 1/3 of the very best farmland in Russia. It included a half of Russia's available iron ore and coal. And even 1/5 of the population of the Russian Empire lived on the land which was given up in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So Russia paid a very, very high price. Bolshevik Russia paid a very, very high price to achieve peace. But it was a price that Lenin felt had to be paid because the Russian people had to have relief from the war and from the misery and suffering that the war had caused. Anything less would lead to the loss of support for him and his government, and perhaps even another revolution. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk brought an end to Russia's role in the First World War. That then led to a new kind of threat, maybe not a threat, but a problem. Russia's former allies, the British, the French, the Italians, the Japanese, the Serbs, and then eventually too the Americans, they were counting on Russia to stay in the war, to keep pressure off of the Western Front. The Americans, British, French, they wanted to keep German soldiers off the Western Front. The only way to do that was to keep Russia fighting on the Eastern Front. And so the British and French and Americans had made efforts to deliver war materials to Russia to try to keep Russia's provisional government fighting the war. The British and French and others had managed to get some weapons in through this very northern route, although that was only available maybe 6 months out of the year. The Americans and Japanese had gotten weapons in through the east. But now that the provisional government had been overthrown and the Bolsheviks had taken Russia out of the war, the other Allied powers were ticked off. The British, French, Americans, Italians, Serbs, Japanese, they were ticked off that Russia had dropped out of the war. And what they definitely did not want was for the Bolsheviks to get their hands on the weapons that had been delivered for the Russians, many of which were still sitting in warehouses in the ports where they had been delivered. And so, Allied soldiers actually in 1917, 1918 invaded Russia. The Russians had been invaded by the Germans since the start of the war, but now, starting in the spring of 1918, Allied soldiers invaded Russia's ports and occupied them. You can see British, French, Italians, and Serbs here, Americans, British, and French here, Americans and Japanese here. Allied soldiers actually invaded Russian ports. Here you see American soldiers marching through Vladivostok, that city in eastern Russia on the Pacific coast. And these ports were occupied by Allied soldiers until the Allied soldiers could secure the weapons that had been delivered to Russia for the purpose of keeping Russia in the war. Now that the Bolsheviks had taken Russia out of the war, the Allies did not want them to get their hands on those weapons. So Allied soldiers invaded and occupied Russian ports in 1918, right into the year 1919, until they could secure the weapons so that the Bolsheviks couldn't get their hands on them. This was a bad beginning in relations between Bolshevik Russia and the former allies of Russia, the Americans, British, French, and it really soured the relations between Russia and the Western countries. Really from the very beginning, Russia had a sort of a bad taste in their mouth, a bad attitude toward the Western countries. And of course, that only got worse over time. But once the German invasion came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the kind of threats that faced Lenin and his government were more internal threats. They came from inside Russia, in the form of the people who wanted to bring back one of the old governments, either the Tsar or the Provisional government. And there were plenty of people in Russia. Just because the Bolsheviks claimed to represent the interests of the vast majority of the Russian people did not mean that the vast majority of the Russian people actually agreed with that. And so there were plenty of Russians, powerful Russians, of course, who wanted to bring back the Tsar, but there were also millions of Russians who wanted to bring back the provisional government. And so a lot of the threats that were faced by Lenin at the beginning were internal threats coming from inside Russia. In order to deal with these threats, Lenin and the Bolsheviks formed their own secret police. So remember that the Tsar had a secret police. And as a matter of fact, it was the Tsar's secret police who had killed Lenin's brother and sort of sent him down this path of radicalism and being a revolutionary and a communist. Now Lenin and the Bolsheviks formed their own secret police to root out and eliminate and silence the enemies of the Bolsheviks. This secret police was called the Cheka, and there's a group of Cheka officers sitting in that strange little picture to the right. So the secret police of Lenin and the Bolsheviks were called the Cheka, and it was their job to discover people who were looking to overthrow Lenin's government, people who were enemies or rivals or critics of Lenin's government. It was their job to find them and then silence them, eliminate them, kill them. That was the job of the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police. Their first target was the Tsar and his family. It was decided that as long as there were people out there who wanted to try to restore the monarchy, as long as there were people in Russian society who wanted to restore the Tsar to full power, absolute power, they could not be allowed to remain alive. That as long as the Tsar was then alive, that would give hope to the Tsarists, to the monarchists, that they could achieve a restoration of the monarchy. And so it was decided that the Tsar and his family must be arrested and then executed. So the Tsar and his family had actually been moved around from place to place after being arrested. They had been placed under house arrest, but they had been moved from location to location. And finally, one day, the Cheka decided it was time to execute them. So they had the Tsar and his family gather in a sort of a basement space in one of the houses they were staying in. And the members of the Cheka then entered the room. They announced to Tsar Nicholas II that it had been decided to execute all of them. The Tsar said, "What?" Turned to his family, and when he turned back to face the Cheka, they shot him. And what followed then was a period of almost uncontrolled gunfire, in which you can see the damage to the room itself. The walls were destroyed, the plaster walls, by all the gunfire. A period of about 2 minutes of uncontrolled gunfire, in which the room filled with smoke, and the officer in charge could barely get his men to stop shooting. When he did, and when the smoke cleared, it was found that all of the members of the family had been hit by gunfire, not surprisingly, but yet some had not yet died. The Tsar and his wife Alexandra had died. Their son, the Tsarchik, Alexei, was still breathing and moaning. The officer in charge of the Cheka put a pistol to his head and finished him off. The two older daughters were also still alive and moaning and groaning. It was found that they had secret compartments in their dresses in which they had stuffed the family's jewelry, and that had actually blocked the bullets from getting them and killing them. So the Cheka bayoneted them to death, and their bodies were then buried in a marsh outside of the town where they were killed. That was the beginning then of what was called the Red Terror. The Tsar, the murder of the Tsar and his family, the end of the Romanov family, the murder of the Romanov family, was just the beginning of what was called the Red Terror. During the Red Terror, the Cheka went out and they murdered people sort of indiscriminately, people who were seen as enemies of the government or enemies of the state or enemies of the people. These were usually priests, Russian Orthodox priests and monks, and then nobles. It didn't matter what you had done. You could have been a priest or a monk who was kind to the people. You could have been a noble who was kind to the people who worked on the fields. But you were being murdered not for what you had done, but for who you were. During the Red Terror, people were being murdered for who they were. You were an enemy of the Russian people because you were connected to the church. You were an enemy of the Russian people because you were a noble. So it's kind of like the Great Fear during the French Revolution. But this time it was not being carried out in a sort of disorderly way by peasants, but in a very systematic and very orderly way by the Cheka, the communist secret police. So it was mass murder. It resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Russians, priests, monks, nobles, and their families. And the Cheka were extremely brutal in the manner in which they did this. They were known for, they would take a family of nobles and they would tell the mother of the family that if she would, and then that if she would submit to being honestly sexually assaulted, raped, If she would submit to that, then they would spare her children. And then the Cheka officers would rape the woman, and then they would kill her children anyway, and her as well. There were cases of crucifixion in which Russian Orthodox priests or monks were actually nailed up to crosses or nailed up to trees and crucified in the 20th century. Read this. Some of the Cheka's torture methods were matched only by the Spanish Inquisition. Each local Cheka had its own specialty, so the different Chekas did different things to their victims. In Kharkov, they went in for the glove trick, burning the victim's hands in boiling water until the blistered skin could be peeled off. This left the victims with raw and bleeding hands and their torturers with human gloves, so the Cheka would then take the skin and put it on their own hands. The Tsaritsyn Cheka sawed its victims' bones in half. In Voronezh, they rolled their naked victims in nail-studded barrels. In Armavir, they crushed their skulls by tightening a leather strap with an iron belt around their head. In Kiev, they affixed a cage with rats to the victim's torso and heated it so that the enraged rats ate their way through the victim's guts in an effort to escape. In Odessa, they chained their victims to planks and pushed them slowly into a furnace or a tank of boiling water. A favorite winter torture was to pour water on the naked victims until they became living ice statues. So they froze people to death, and I think that's what you're seeing in this horrible picture. So the Cheka, Lenin's secret police, were extremely brutal in their methods of torture. They didn't simply execute people, but they brutalized them beforehand. And this was the Red Terror. This was the way that Lenin, in his totalitarian dictatorship, eliminated internal threats, people who might challenge him or try to overthrow him. And as I said, several 100,000 Russians were killed. So this begins to give you a little sense of how things were under Lenin's leadership in Soviet Russia. We'll continue this in the next lesson. So until then, take good care of yourselves. Let's try to stay healthy, try to stay safe, and we'll see you again.